Okay. Okay, is everyone able to see the title slide now? Okay, please let me know if you can't.
Yep, you're good. Oh, real quick, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry to pop back in here. If you have questions along the way, if you just want to type those in the chat towards the end, we'll get to as many of those as possible. Sorry, carry on.
Great, thanks. So thank you, Holly and Keystone Trails Association for inviting me. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight. This presentation is geared toward avid hikers and trail friends who perform maintenance. Being out on the trail a lot, I bet that you have already encountered most of the species I'll discuss today. Some of them have probably detracted from your outdoor experience. Some may have been spread by your activities. And I bet that some of them could potentially be first detected in an area by you once you learn a little more. So it's really important that you get out there and learn more about invasives. All right. So my goals today are to help you understand what invasive plants are and some of the characteristics that make them problematic. I'm going to go into detail about 10 species that I think are especially important to know for recreating and working along Pennsylvania hiking trails. There are many more invasive plants and other types of invasive species that I won't have time to address tonight, but this should give you a really good start on the topic. Invasives have a lot of different names. You might hear people referring to them as non-natives, non-indigenous harmful species, exotics, aliens, weeds, or noxious plants. So just to clarify, noxious weeds are a subset of invasive plants. There is actually a noxious weed list that is administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And noxious weeds are actually a specific species that either are or will soon be banned from sale in Pennsylvania, and they're not allowed to be transported or propagated within the state. So when people use the term noxious plants, that is referring to a very specific subset of species. So generally, what are invasive species? Some of them are pretty scary. They are alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause harm in terms of economics, the environment, or human health. When I say alien species, I mean species that have not evolved here. And then it's really important to think about, okay, in terms of an alien species, like tomatoes didn't evolve here, but they're not considered invasive species because they actually have benefits for economics and humans. Similarly, when I'm talking about invasive species, I'm not talking about things like poison ivy, which do harm human health, but poison ivy is a native species that evolved here. So just some clarification. Alien species that have some sort of harm. There are many different characteristics that are common across most invasive plant species. They can often spring up wherever there is a little bit of open ground and available resources. So they tolerate generally a pretty wide variety of conditions. And once they reach a new area, can often grow quickly and reproduce abundantly. Many invasive plants have seeds that can live for a long time in the soil. We call this a seed bank. So that means that even if you get rid of some of the plants that you see, there still could be more waiting in the soil to germinate later. Invasive plants are often hard to control. This can be in part because of large or long roots. Some of the perennial plants that I'll tell you about have underground roots that can actually spread really far, and a small piece of them can lead to a new infestation. If you're out looking for invasive plants, early spring or late fall can be a good time to find them because many of them have a longer leaf lifespan than our native plants. And invasive plants are adapted to spread in different ways. So some of them spread with crop seeds. Some of them spread easily by natural agents like wind or water or with wild animals. And many of them spread really well with humans, either inadvertently on our boots, with our equipment, and also a lot of our invasive species are transported or were originally transported because of the horticultural trade. So when I talk about plants being really easy to grow and tolerating a wide variety of conditions, of course, that sounds like a gardener's dream, but that can often mean that there is trouble coming. So just to think a little bit about the different kinds of harm that invasive plants cause. This figure actually is looking at all kinds of different invasive species. In the United States, most of the resource damages and losses and management costs due to invasive species are from mammals. The second largest group in terms of cost is plants. So depending upon which scientists you reference, from $1.2 to $4.5 trillion is the estimate for cost related to invasive species between 1960 and 2020. So huge costs. A lot of this is from agriculture. We don't do a great job of keeping track of costs, particularly related to management. And a lot of the costs related to natural areas are kind of tough to quantify. You know, if you're thinking in terms of rare species, how much does the loss of a rare species, what's the value on that? Invasive species can harm humans directly. There are species like giant hogweed in this photo or wild parsnip that I'll tell you about in a minute that can give you really serious rashes. There are a lot of thorny shrubs and woody vines that can either cause physical damage to us, like multiflora rose, or they can limit our access to different sorts of areas, like getting down to the stream can be difficult if there's a lot of rose there. I'll show you some pictures like that. Some invasive species can cause problems because they're actually habitat for other problematic species. So there's been quite a bit of research now that shows that Japanese barberry, a shrub, makes really good habitat for disease-carrying ticks. So if you're worried about Lyme disease, which we should all be worried about Lyme disease, then you don't want to have barberry out in the woods. Tree of heaven, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, is the favorite host plant for a new invasive insect in the state, the spotted lanternfly. And the spotted lanternfly can affect many of our native species as well as a lot of our orchard crops. As hikers, you're probably expecting to think most in terms of damage to natural areas with regard to invasive species. Invasive species are thought to be the second most important threat to biodiversity, and it's estimated that about 42% of the threatened and endangered species at the federal level are at risk because of invasive species. Invasive species can alter different ecosystem processes, including wildfire frequency, which has certainly been on our mind a lot more these days. Invasive species can also change water and nutrient cycles, as well as soil erosion rates. And when areas have a lot of invasive species, we can see reduced wildlife cover and food quality or quantity. Thinking a little more about some specific changes related to natural areas, we can see that there is a loss of some of our native species more gradually. For example, with oriental bittersweet, the pollen of oriental bittersweet is more viable than our native American bittersweet. So they are able to actually interbreed, and that dilutes that native gene pool. So we're losing our native bittersweet. Similar to our native black walnut, there are several invasive species that produce chemicals that are emitted from their roots that act like herbicides to limit or prevent the establishment of other species, such as the spotted knapweed and tree of heaven. There are a lot of interactions that can be disrupted when we have invasive species in an area. So, for example, there's a butterfly called the West Virginia white butterfly. This is a native butterfly. And the native West Virginia white butterfly lays its eggs on a spring ephemeral plant called the toothwort. And the larvae need to feed on the toothwort to develop. But when garlic mustard moves in, the adult butterflies are tricked into laying their eggs on garlic mustard, but the larvae aren't able to survive when they feed on the garlic mustard. We can see some structural changes within an area that has invasive species. So in woodlands, where the native shrubs are replaced with invasive shrubs like honeysuckle or buckthorn, the way that these shrubs are shaped can actually allow for predators to more easily get in to attack nesting bird babies and eggs. And when we're thinking in terms of the forest structure overall, when there's a very thick carpet of invasives like the stiltgrass in this photo, that's really keen competition for resources like light and water and nutrients. And this affects seedling recruitment. So that means that shrubs and trees aren't able to move up into the forest. So you have this much more simplified forest setting. And if there was ever damage to the overstory trees, there wouldn't be smaller trees there to replace them. So how are invasive plants spread? Humans do a really great job of spreading them inadvertently. We talked about this a little bit already. Sometimes we can have seeds of invasive plants on our boots, on our pants. Our pets can carry a lot of invasive species in their fur. Similarly, if we have vehicles in the tire tread or other types of equipment, we can be moving invasive species propagules, seeds with that, or little pieces of invasive species. And if we have contaminated fill or mulch, those kinds of materials can bring in invasive species by accident. Plantings are a way that we get a lot of invasive species. Not everybody knows what species are invasive, and it can take a while for a species to become problematic. So when we first started planting burning bush, for example, people didn't realize this was going to become a problem with time, but it has started to spread out into the forest. So these are the species that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in today. Again, there are many more invasive species, and there are a lot of great resources out there. I will share a few of my favorites with you at the end of the talk. All of the species I'm going to talk about today are noxious weeds. Again, those are species that you either right now or in the near future you cannot sell or transport or propagate, with the exception of Chinese silvergrass. Chinese silvergrass is not on the noxious weed list. In my opinion, tree of heaven might be our most serious invasive species. Because it is a large tree when mature. And so this has the ability to really change our, forest-dominated state. So I'll make note with all of these species regarding their growth form, Obviously, this is a tree, right? So it's a woody perennial. That means it lives for many years. The name tree of heaven supposedly refers to this tree's ability to grow really quickly towards the sky. Tree of heaven can grow in a wide variety of habitats, from open to partially shaded conditions, and also in a wide range of soil conditions, including, up through sidewalk cracks. Some people think that tree of heaven leaves smell like rancid peanut butter or cat urine. I don't know if any of you have experienced that. If you're looking for more visual ways to identify it, one leaf can range from 1 to 4 feet in length and have up to 40 leaflets. When I'm looking at a tree of heaven leaflets, something that I watch for is the fact that, most of the leaflet will be fairly smooth on the edge, but they have what I refer to as like little earlobes. So down towards the base of the leaflets, you can see that little, almost like an appendage. So that's a really good way to distinguish tree of heaven from some of its lookalikes. Once the tree is mature, its seeds are quite distinctive. And this is a species that has separate male and female individuals. So you only find the seeds on the female tree. And its bark is smooth when it's young, but as it gets older, you can see what it looks like there on the right. Some people believe it's sort of like the outside of a cantaloupe. Tree of heaven is often confused with staghorn sumac. Staghorn sumac has teeth all along the edge of the leaflets, not just little earlobes. The stem is very fuzzy, and of course, once it's mature enough to set seed, then you won't be confused, right? Staghorn sumac has those red cone-shaped seed heads. Black walnut is another species that is often confused with tree of heaven. Again, black walnut has teeth all along its leaflet. It has much more deeply furrowed bark and very different fruits. I feel like a lot of people confuse these. So definitely check out the Virginia Tech reference guide if you need a little more help, and they compare tree of heaven with some other similar species. Wild parsnip is a species that I'm just starting to notice around Pennsylvania. It's very common in the Midwest. This is a species that actually gives you a really bad rash when you have the sap on your skin and then you go out into the sunlight. So this is one that everyone should be aware of, so that you're not getting, these blisters. It's basically a chemical burn from this plant. So in areas that have this, you definitely want to be wearing long pants. And if you're touching it, wearing gloves. The habitat for wild parsnip is more open areas. You won't find this in a thick forest. So again, you need to have a good bit of sunlight for this plant. It can tolerate a pretty wide range of soil conditions. When you're identifying this plant, you want to look for, again, the leaves that have many different leaflets, 5 to 10 leaflets that do have some coarse teeth along their edge, almost a fern-like shape to those leaves. And then the flower is a flat cluster with yellow blossoms. So it's important when we're thinking about control of species to note that this is a biannual. So that means that wild parsnip has a 2-year life cycle. So its first year, it germinates from seed and just has this sort of round clump of leaves. The second year is when you get the seed head that grows up tall. You see the yellow flowers and then the seeds maturing. So if you're able to control this species before that late second year, then you're in pretty good shape. with it, right? So frequent mowing, for example, in these open areas can be great for this species. Another biannual plant with a 2-year life cycle is garlic mustard. I bet all of you have seen garlic mustard. Its first year, it again has just sort of this clump of leaves. Some of you may have eaten this leaf. Of course, don't eat anything unless you're really sure that you know what it is, but it does have, you know, garlicky fragrance and taste. Heart or triangle shaped leaves. And then the second year is when it gets its stem and 4-petaled white flowers. This species needs partial to more heavy shade. You won't find this too often in really bright light. But again, you know, as long as you get a little shade, it can sometimes be happy, can have a wide variety of soil conditions. Multiflora rose. I have learned to identify multiflora rose by how it feels. It's very unpleasant for recreating. It can be a very rambling, horizontally spreading shrub. It can also get up to 15 feet tall. It grows in open areas like old fields and roadsides. And then also goes from the forest edge into even fairly dense forests where there might be some canopy gaps. We have some native roses within Pennsylvania, but you won't find our native roses deep within the forest. To help with identification of this, if you look all the way in the top left of the picture with the flower, you'll see this sort of fringy piece of tissue where the leaf connects to the stem. That's called a stipule. So on the multiflora rose, it has those little fringes. Our native roses have a more smooth piece of tissue for that stipule. So multiflora rose, again, it has our typical compound alternate rose leaves, like similar to what you would find at the florist shop for roses. It does have thorns, white flowers, and then red fruits or rose hips that will be dispersed by birds. This again is another woody perennial, like all of our roses. Japanese barberry, another woody perennial that has spines. Japanese barberry can grow deep in the woods as well as along woodland edges. This one has oval-shaped leaves that are smooth along the edge. And then the red berries are really prominent in the fall, as well as the foliage usually turns a nice bright red. We have a couple different species of knotweed. Japanese knotweed and giant knotweed. And then the hybrid is Bohemian knotweed. So here you can see what those leaf shapes are. Similar to garlic mustard, this is another one that some people eat, the young shoots. Again, you want to be really sure what you're eating before you go ahead and do that. But you can see these leaf shapes here, very easy to identify, those big triangle leaves. Its stems are large and cane-like. It looks like a bamboo. It's often confused for bamboo. This can grow quite large. It can also extend from its underground roots up to 30 feet from where you see knotweed. You can end up with a new patch that's actually all connected. The primary habitat for these invasive knotweeds is in wetter areas, like along wetlands and stream corridors and ditches. But I'm starting to see it getting into more forested habitats and drier habitats. So it does seem like once it gets growing, it can spread all sorts of different places. Japanese stiltgrass. This one, I'm sure most of you have encountered out on the trail. It grows really well on old logging roads or trail sides. It will grow almost anywhere that has at least partial shade. And it also, usually needs some level of moisture within the soil. So you won't find it in super dry areas. It can form a sort of tangled mat, but stays quite short. It's pretty uncommon for it to get more than a couple feet tall. Some ways to identify Japanese stiltgrass. The leaf blades will be about 1 to 3 inches long, and they have this silvery stripe that runs almost down the middle. So it's a little bit off center in the leaves. And then in that left picture here, you can see stilt-like prop roots. This is where it gets its name. This is the only one of my species that is not currently a noxious weed. This is Chinese silvergrass. I'm used to hearing it mostly called by its scientific genus name, Miscanthus. So this is still sold in the nursery trade. The flowering stalks of this can get up to 15 feet tall. So it's a really big grass. It grows in dense bunches. And it's been invading from roadsides into old fields and forest edges. I have never seen wavy leaf basket grass in person, but some of my colleagues at the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources are very concerned with this species. It's only been known in Pennsylvania since 2016. So this is a species that we still have a chance to slow its spread. So it's really important if you find this species to think about how you might control it and to contact the Department of Agriculture to see if they might be able to help. This is, again, a smaller grass. It has relatively wide leaves, so about a ½ inch wide. And this sort of ripply or wavy feature to them. On the left-hand picture, another distinction to the wavy leaf basket grass are these long pin-shaped structures called awns. So these awns help the seeds to attach to things like your clothing or your pet's fur. And then the last species that I'll highlight today, this is another one that is not yet ubiquitous around the state. These are the swallowworts, both the pale on the left and the black on the right. This is an herbaceous perennial vine. The swallowworts are closely related to our native milkweeds. So kind of like the story of the garlic mustard, the swallowworts can attract monarch butterflies to lay their eggs, but if the monarch lays its eggs on the swallowworts, the larvae aren't able to develop. The swallowworts are also toxic to livestock. The habitat for these species are limestone-based soils that are dry to sort of medium dry. They can't tolerate a lot of moisture, and they would be found in partial to full sun conditions. So again, not deep in the forest, but along forest edges potentially, definitely along old fields. So to identify this plant, again, it has these twining vines like you can see in the right picture. It grows up to maybe 6 feet tall, and then it dies back. That above ground shoot dies back every winter. Notice that it has opposite leaves with pointed tips, and then these 5-petaled star-shaped flowers. There is a native species called the honey vine that looks a good bit like this, but that one has white flowers. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about some of these invasive species, again, there are many more, but these are some that I think are extra important for folks out on the trails. What do we do about invasive plants? There are a lot of different strategies. Obviously, it's best if we can prevent invasive species, then we don't have to deal with doing much else, okay? We'll talk through all these different steps. If you're out hiking, there are some ways that you can prevent invasive species. Obviously, some common sense stuff, start out with clean shoes and gear. When you're out in the woods, if you stay on the trails, that helps to prevent introduction of potential invasive species that are along those trails into new areas and can make it easier for management down the road. And then you want to remove any seeds on yourself or your gear or your pets before leaving. If you are working with a trail club, you might want to consider installing and maintaining boot brushes that have some signs about invasive species to tell people why they're important. These do help to slow the spread of invasive species. It's not sort of a one-time put it up and never do anything again, though. You do occasionally have to, remove some of the soil from around the base of those and every now and then replace the bristles. So if you're doing trail maintenance and you're thinking about prevention, one of the things you want to do is try to protect any healthy native plant communities, either by minimizing disturbance, or if you are getting in there to do some vegetation maintenance, if you can allow the native species to first set their seeds, that will allow them to continue, okay? And of course, preventing the introduction or spread of invasive species, you can do that obviously by not planting invasive species, by trying to use weed-free materials. Sometimes you can find materials that are certified weed-free, but if you can't, just being really aware of where your materials like straw or fill are coming from. If you have any projects that you're working on, you want to begin your project in areas that do not have invasive species. If you move through weedy areas, be sure you clean your equipment before leaving there and getting to your new spot. And then if you are causing any sort of disturbance to the ground or the vegetation, reestablish vegetation that you want as soon as possible. That minimizes the area for invasive species you don't want to move in. Of course, invasive species isn't just all about, us being out on the trail. There are a lot of other ways that they can get there. Wind, animals, water, other people, right, who aren't learning about invasive species now and being careful. So it's really important to keep your eye open for invasive species, especially those couple of new ones that I mentioned to you. If you're not a plant expert, that's okay. There are a lot of apps now that can help us identify invasive species. iNaturalist is my favorite. I wouldn't suggest relying solely on iNaturalist to guide your control, but it's a really good place to start. If you catch an invasive species early, then you can avoid them becoming huge problems. For trail clubs, I would recommend that you have a way to document new occurrences of invasive species along your stretch of trail and any kind of treatment that you do, and treatment areas that need follow-up. So as I'll talk about in a little while, you're going to want to return to areas where you control invasive species for at least a few years to make sure that you're not getting any resprouting from the individuals you tried to kill or from the seed bank. If you find invasive species, then before you start your control efforts, the most important thing is to do your research on the species, make sure you know what it is, and look up recommended control methods. So I'm going to give you a little taste of it today, but again, what I'm telling you today, the amount of time we have, really is not enough. There are a lot of great resources out there, and I'll recommend some of my favorites to you. You want to know how big of an area is invaded with your species. If there are any restrictions to what you can do in the area, like if it's a natural area, there are some restrictions. If there are waterways, know who your neighbors are. You don't want to get complaints about your control methods. Think really hard about how much time and money and people power you have, because invasive species control is not easy. You'll probably need to prioritize if it's a large area or you're sort of beginning the journey of trying to manage invasives. So if you're trying to prioritize which invasive species or which patches of invasive species to control, I recommend you start with densities that are low. So start where you're going to be able to sort of head off that big problem down the road. Certainly think about areas where you're going to have a lot of activity, a lot of potential for movement of seeds or plant material out, like roadways or trailheads. And if you have a new project you're planning, like building shelters or spur trails, if you can get in ahead of time to that area and the adjacent area and clean out invasive species first, that will make things easier down the road. Mechanical control is kind of the preferred method by most people when it's possible, right? It has the lowest impact to the surrounding community. When I'm talking about mechanical control, I'm referring to things like pulling, mowing, cutting, raking, or smothering. If you are going to try mechanical control, it's really important to get out there before seed set, or else you have at least one more year of work if the seeds have already matured. Many species, including garlic mustard, someone submitted this question, it really is necessary to bag and remove species like garlic mustard if they're close to seed set. The seeds can still mature on plants even after they've been pulled. And so this is a long-term commitment, right? So annuals, you're worrying about the seed bank. Perennials, you're worrying about those underground energy stores. So you're going to need to follow up the next year, regardless of what species we're talking about. For mechanical control, if you have very young, small plants, regardless of species, you'll probably be able to pull those. You need to be sure to get all of the roots, particularly when we're dealing with species that have the ability to sprout from small bits of root material like Japanese knotweed or tree of heaven. When you're dealing with biannuals, like wild parsnip or garlic mustard, or annuals like stiltgrass, or someone had asked a question about the mile-a-minute vine, those can be controlled really well with mechanical methods. Again, being careful to get in there before seeds are produced. And multiflora rose is one of the few woody perennials that you will be able to control if you do frequent cutting throughout the season. Someone submitted the question to me asking my opinion on herbicides. So at home and in nature, I avoid using pesticides whenever possible, but there are certain situations where I think they're necessary. So in terms of invasive species, with really tough to kill invasive species, like Japanese knotweed, or where you have really extensive infestations, I think herbicides are the way to go. You can combine herbicides with mechanical methods to reduce the amount of chemical you need to put out in the environment and to reduce non-target impacts. But you're going to need to reapply. Again, just because you're using herbicides, it doesn't mean that one visit and your job is done. So when we're talking about herbicidal control, post-emergent herbicides are pretty common. Glyphosate is effective for most species. Do a little more homework. There are different concentrations recommended for different species. You can do cut stump or foliar spray for the shrubs, multiflora rose and Japanese barberry. Again, cut stump means you're only applying herbicide just to the cut woody top of that. So that's a nice way to reduce chemicals. Knotweed is really tough, probably one of our toughest, if not the toughest to get rid of. If you're in a high quality natural area, you can use stem injection of herbicides. What I've seen recommended by most folks is that you go in June and cut or spray the Japanese knotweed, allow it to regrow a little bit to use up some of its underground energy, and then go back in late summer and spray it again. Tree of heaven, you always want to do the herbicide work there in the late season so that it will take the herbicides down into its roots. Avoid cut stump for tree of heaven. And if you have a lot of it, prioritize those female trees that will produce seed. Chinese silvergrass, wavy basket grass, and swallowworts, you can use foliar sprays with all of those. And again, I had someone asking about mile-a-minute vine. For that one, you might want to consider both post-emergent herbicide and pre-emergent herbicide to control the seeds. Biocontrol is when we use organisms, typically from the native range of the species, to feed on our invasive. Biocontrol has a bad rap, but now it undergoes very extensive testing to be sure that the biocontrol agents we bring in are host specific. So there are many benefits to using biocontrol. It can allow us to avoid harm on natives. We can control really large areas. And after that initial testing and release, it's pretty low cost. It also means that we're not using chemicals. So we have a potential for biocontrol agents to help us out with knotweed, tree of heaven, multiflora rose, and garlic mustard soon. There is a lot of research underway for these species. There is a weevil out there for mile-a-minute. But again, I found some questionable recommendations about, maybe moving around the infested mile-a-minute to move the weevil, since you can't, as a private landowner, buy the weevil. But I've been emailing some folks. I'm still a little unsure of the legality of that, but maybe I might know more soon, hopefully. Okay, so after you have controlled invasive species, so we've already talked about the fact that you need to dispose of plant parts properly in the landfill or burning. You're going to need to go back and monitor for the reoccurrence of the target invasive species and anything new that has moved in. Definitely learn more about invasives, teach other people about invasives, and where possible, you want to replant with natives. And replanting or restoration is really important because it reduces the sites for invasion. You can also use planting to alter the habitat to make it less suitable for invasive species. So if you have an invasive species that requires full sunlight and you plant shrubs and trees there, eventually they're going to shade out and make that habitat no longer suitable for your invasive. There are a lot of great native alternatives out there sold by the nurseries. Native is one of those words that everybody uses differently. Something native to Pennsylvania when possible. Even better is, if it was actually from local stock. Don't dig it out of the woods to plant at your spot, right? Because now you've made another open spot that probably will get invaded. Be careful when you're choosing your native alternatives that you're matching the habitat conditions to what that native species wants. And then you just need to be kind of attentive in the early years if the plant is getting off to a good start. You may need to water them the first few years, or at least at planting, depending on how big of an area and how far out in the wild we're talking about. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I know you have a lot of other activities that you could be doing on this summer evening. Here's my contact information. You can feel free to shoot me an email if I don't get to your questions tonight, or if you have them down the road. There are a lot of people who know way more than I do about invasive species at the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources and Penn State Extension. So contact those folks, or at least refer to some of these references I've provided here. If you find new invasive species, occurrences of the swallowwort or of the wavy leaf basket grass, you can report those to IMAP Invasives. And if you're trying to figure out what native plants you could use for restoration, there is some information at the DCNR link there at the bottom. You can look for that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Autumn. This was delightful. We did have a few questions. I'm going to be very mindful of the time because, like you said, everybody is so generous and so wonderful for taking time to be part of this. It's so important. But I do want to also be mindful of everybody's time. So we did have a couple questions. We'll see if we can just get some quick answers to those. Somebody had mentioned towards the beginning, the question was simply, what about poison hemlock? So I'm not sure exactly how you want to address that, but thoughts on poison hemlock?
Sure, yeah. So poison hemlock is another species. It's kind of closely related to the hogweed and the parsnip. So that's another one that can, it's one of the many other invasive species out there that you could address. To me, it's not one of, I didn't put it in the top 10 for things to worry about along the trail, but yeah, it's another one to be concerned with.
Somebody else was asking, is there a disease going about the knotweed?
I do not know about a knotweed disease. It doesn't mean there's not one. There are diseases that I know affecting tree of heaven as well as multiflora rose. But if there is a knotweed disease, it's new to me. That doesn't mean there isn't.
Right. Can you plant the stumps with the herbicide, like using a paintbrush?
Yeah, so that's a good strategy for most woody plants, to cut them and then paint the stump. Again, of the species we talked about today, the only one that I recommend against doing that is tree of heaven, because it's really good at root suckering, and you'll probably still end up with root suckers.
We have two more questions. Why is cut stump not recommended for, I'm going to butcher this, ailanthus?
Yep. So ailanthus is tree of heaven. So again, it doesn't seem to be effective at killing the roots. And so you need to get a lot more herbicide on there. You could sort of paint the stump or hack and squirt, where you're getting more herbicide that will be shunted down into the roots. But it's about getting a large quantity of herbicide down into the roots for that one.
How about controlling greenbrier?
So greenbrier, and someone had another question that was submitted previously. Greenbrier and poison ivy are two native species. So they're both annoying for different reasons, right? Poison ivy is annoying because it gives us rash. Greenbrier is annoying because it has thorns. They can both grow pretty aggressively. They're both woody vines. So you can use a lot of the similar methods for those. You can cut them and put herbicide just on the stems, or you could use foliar sprays for either of those. You can also, with poison ivy or other plants that like, at least some more open habitat, some more sunlight, planting shrubs and trees to help shade out the habitats can be effective. But again, not technically invasive species. They're both native species.
Got it. And we did have another question pop in here. Do prescribed burns help control the spread of these alien invasives?
Yeah, so there's lots of research that has been done on using prescribed fire, and it's really species specific. So you'll often knock back the top of these perennial woody plants by using prescribed fire, but it needs to be a really hot fire to get rid of the seed bank. And if you have woody plants with a lot of energy reserves underground, you can see a lot of them sprouting back up. And also, once you have a prescribed fire, then you usually get rid of the leaf litter and a lot of the plant community. So you can then end up having more open, bare ground for new plants to move in. So you need to be very strategic. It depends on which species you're controlling and what the other members of the community are.
Wonderful. Well, those were, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, well, if you're done with those questions, we did still have one other one that had been asked.
Oh yeah,
beforehand.
Sure.
So someone had submitted before the presentation a question about just leaving invasive species alone. And I think this is a really important one to address. So depending upon what the species is, how big the invasion is, and where it's located, it's possible that you'll decide that control just isn't feasible. And this is totally understandable because it's a big job controlling even a small patch of invasive species. But know that if this is your choice, it's highly unlikely that the situation will improve with time. So invasive species, their nature is that they're really good at spreading. So unless there's a major change in the habitat, you're going to get a worse problem down the road. And I have watched this myself happen in several areas. So for example, there's this small woodland patch in the midst of a residential area that's about a mile from my house. And I used to run there in the spring to see the spring ephemerals, just sort of like this bonus, getting my exercise and seeing the wildflowers. And there were just a few garlic mustard plants when I first found this spot. But each year there were more. And now it's almost all garlic mustard, and I don't bother going there anymore. It just makes me sad. And so there are some other interesting things sort of to think about with this. There's a hypothesis called the invasional meltdown hypothesis, where there's been a lot of research that shows once you have one invasive species, sometimes having one invasive species can facilitate other invasive species moving in. So that's another reason why we sometimes may get a problem worsening, where it's a greater variety of invasive species with time. So again, understandable from an operational standpoint why you might want to leave invasive species alone, but they will probably turn into a worse problem. There is a little bit of evidence out there that garlic mustard may eventually start to change the soil in a way that makes it a worse growing environment for itself. So there's a little bit of evidence that garlic mustard populations might like peak and then go back down, but it's, I would say, still early days to know if that's going to play out everywhere.
Awesome. Thank you again for sharing all this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful information. Super helpful, super thorough. And if this was awesome for you, which I hope that it was, we will be having a plant ID walking workshop with Autumn in September. And just wanted to clarify, I think I said earlier that this was about invasives. This is not just invasive. This is general plant ID. So it's going to be super fun, really wonderful, very interactive. So please consider signing up for that. And if you're interested as well, we do have a lot of other different opportunities for education and training through our Trail Academy, through Keystone Trails Association. You can check that out on our website. And just thank you again so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing out there, whether you're with a trail club or a hiker or just generally interested, whatever it is, whatever you're contributing to this cause. Thank you. It's important. It's very, very appreciated. And yeah, we're super, super grateful for you, Autumn, and we're looking forward to hanging out with you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.